This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning and happy Valentine's Day. Thank you for joining us for our February Clear Up the Chaos. A few things I wanted to make you aware of. So our March Clear Up the Chaos that takes place the second Tuesday of every month. That's going to be taking place March 14th, and that's during spring break. So I know if you have kiddos, most of you may have an adjusted schedule that week. So I wanted to let you know that that is going to be pre-recorded ahead of time, and I will supply the recording to you. So just go ahead and sign up like normal, and then I will send that recording to you, and you can watch at your free opportunity that you might have. I also did want to let you know our Q1 seminar, our virtual seminar has been scheduled. So if you're interested in attending that, that's going to be taking place on Tuesday, March 7th. And I'll be distributing more information on that as well. But it's going to be on coaching and performance management. So that's something that I hope you and your organization can attend and learn from. And I'm going to hand things off to Amanda for her to begin sharing what she has to share with us this morning. You're welcome.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this morning. Happy Valentine's Day. We've got a couple of topics here for you, but we're going to start off with the PUMP Act. And if you heard any of the news kind of over the holidays, this went through the House and the Senate right between Christmas and New Year's, and then got signed in as part of this sending bill late last month. So the modifications to this act is actually what's new. So the change is pretty minor that went through in January, but we are, of course, like we're normally going to do back up a step and even talk about the act as a whole, and then we'll explain the changes that went into effect. Because it might be one of those things that you did not realize you were not meeting the standards for, or that you've heard about and just don't fully understand. So we're going to break it down, not only the new things, but the existing policy in place. So the big change, or as you've seen it headlined, is FLS protections for employees to pump breast milk at work. So first stop there, because you're going to hear me say FLSA, or if you've ever listened before or been on the phone with Mitch or I, you have probably heard us say FLSA at some point. FLSA is the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the reason it comes up so often and on so many of our calls is, although it can contribute to a lot of different things, it specifically talks about exempt versus non-exempt employees. So a lot of times you guys use the language hourly or salaried, and then we come back and we say exempt or non-exempt because there's some minor differences. But just remember, exempt means exempt from overtime. And Fair Labor Standards Act is what puts a lot of those measures in place. So what we're going to be talking about is protections under the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, for employees to pump breast milk at work. And the actual long form of the bill is called Providing Urgent Maternal Protections for Nursing Mothers Act. So it was very nice of them to just call it the PUMP Act as the acronym there. And then to break it down, the PUMP Act is for nursing mothers, and it requires that organizations provide time and space for breastfeeding parents. So if you weren't aware, this actually passed in 2010 as a part of the Affordable Care Act. And with so many changes that went in with ACA, some people caught on to this and all of the nuances, and some people didn't, just trying to adapt to everything else, or they might be vaguely aware of it, is more what I see. But the act initially already required that employers provide a reasonable amount of time, our favorite word, to express breast milk and provide a place for pumping. And this had to be a space other than the bathroom, and it has to be shielded from view both publicly and privately, which again, all sounds pretty straightforward, right? But it's never really that easy. The previous pumping law excluded most exempt or salaried employees. Okay, again, knowing what we've just talked about, exempt meaning exempt from overtime. So generally, I'm making big generalities here, so I don't want you to panic if this is not exactly what you do. But generally, exempt employees, that's more your managerial, that's people that can make independent decisions, they have a lot more leeway in making their schedule, and they may not have the defined 30-minute lunch break. Like some of your hourly employees might be. And even if they do, whether they take 25 minutes or 35 minutes versus exactly 30 minutes isn't going to change their rate of pay. Whereas with hourly employees, that could factor into their overtime. It could factor into whether you're paying the break. So although there was original legislation back in 2010, it didn't really address what needed to happen for exempt or salaried employees. It really honed in on your hourly employees for the facts that we've mentioned, that most of the time salaried exempt employees are just able to lump this into the rest of their time and make up the time if they've taken extra breaks. But in the last 13 years, there have obviously been enough cases and enough instances where they felt the need to come in and clarify the act as a whole. So the newest part of the PUMP Act actually extends the rights to all breastfeeding employees. And this lasts for the entirety of a baby's first year of life. In addition, the new bill states that, and this is a direct quote, any time spent to express breast milk must be considered hours worked if the employee is also working. And we're going to dive into what that means. And the evidence stating working for this, just some of the things that they mention in all of the articles, the idea behind it was, according to the Surgeon General, this method of breastfeeding can help protect babies from illnesses and also lowers the mother's risk of breast and ovarian cancer. So that was some of the reasoning behind it. And again, as I mentioned, the Senate passed 2 different acts back over the break, and then it went through the House end of December, signed into law in January, and it was part of the very large spending bill that just went through at the beginning of 2023, if you've heard about that. So, okay, that was a lot of background, I know, but we like you to understand the why behind things so that you could better interpret and adapt to your business as needed. But under FLSA, the nursing mothers have the right, again, for a reasonable break time and that place, other than the bathroom, shielded from view and able to express breast milk. And this is for up to 1 year. Okay, let's touch on a few more general protections and information on FLSA for this. Again, PUMP Act, Providing Urgent Maternal Protections for Nursing Mothers Act. I don't think I could do that if I didn't have that cheat sheet up here. Signed in on December 29th of this year. And again, the changes really focused on your hourly employees. And in the past, it used to just be suggested that hourly employees, if let's say they got 15-minute breaks and in the morning and in the afternoon, what they would see happening, or even salaried, is people would use that time or have their employees, as it was originally suggested in the bill, to go in, and if they needed to pump at that time, they would try to correlate that to their break times. And may not cover everything, but they really tried to encourage that. But what they found again is that then people didn't get break times. And so some of the differences in that language that I just read is whether they're compensated or not. So if someone is still working during the break, they want to make sure that they are being compensated as well. They may not be working entirely at all. And so for your hour employees, that would be different. But that FLSA, again, it really normally focuses on anytime we talk about minimum wage, overtime, all of your record keeping. It also really actually talks about child labor standards, anything affecting full-time and part-time employees in the private sector, and also in federal, state, and local governments. Sometimes once you get into the public sector, there are some different exceptions there. But in general, it's going to be your private sector that we're focusing on today, because if we have questions about the other specifics, let's talk about those separately. And again, it's for employees to pump while they're at work. It is important to mention, because sometimes this comes up on some of our calls, that FLSA doesn't necessarily preempt any state or local laws if the state or local laws give a greater protection to the employees. What does that mean? A lot of times when we are talking through some specific issues, especially things with overtime and exemptions, you'll hear us talk about, we'll throw out Texas payday law or things like that that are local. because sometimes there's an additional consideration here in Texas, just like in other states and other cities, for things you have to consider. They specifically wrote into this policy that the law of the land is whatever is best for the employees, whatever protects the employees. And that letter of protection is why we mentioned the tie-ins that they have to health benefits to mothers and employees. And so this is the break time. And again, this isn't a statement upon what people necessarily should be. This is not you as the employer telling any of your employees that they have to do this. This is just making sure that they are aware of their rights and that you are following all of the regulations. So again, we hear that word, I've already said it 2 or 3 times, and I think we say it every month too, that the break time has to be reasonable. Now, once again, what does reasonable mean? Well, they don't tell us that. Nothing directly in the bill speaks to the reasonality of a time period. Now, it does go in and talk about that could look different, but where we have to pull this reasonableness, just like when we talk about ADA, where we hear that a lot, is through your business and also through some of the previously existing case law. With this being so new, we may get some information in the coming months or within the next year even where this is tested and challenged. So I would not be surprised if there are some clarifications once this law has fully been put into effect and then has been challenged by employees and employers across the company. So all of this being said, there may be some nuances here that we are not even considering within the HR community, within the legal community, because we don't even know until it's decided upon at court. But again, they're supposed to be given a reasonable amount of time. That could vary pretty greatly on your employees from one to the other. It also could depend upon the business and the setup of your timing and the space allowed. You can't, as an employer, deny a covered employee a needed break to pump. Again, frequency and duration of the breaks themselves could vary, and not just by the mother. You have to also think about, what does your business look like? Some of the examples that I was thinking through and deciding what to talk to you guys about this, obviously very varying differences. Somebody that works in an office 8 to 5 might have a lot more options than somebody that spends 90% of their time on the road. So the accommodation to allow for somebody that is mostly mobile might take more time. It might take more factors to consider to be able to allow that person a private space to nurse when they need to versus an office. And even then, depending on the office situation that you have and how it's set up, where you have them go, whether they are going into a room and then let's say they need to clear off a table and they need to set up a chair. There might be all sorts of factors depending on the space that could make it go 5 or 10 minutes longer day to day and even break to break. So you've got to understand that there may not be entirely consistent or entirely as planned as some of us would like it to be. Some of the different locations, honestly, that I have seen employers make work. So I'll say the calls, not necessarily just from you guys, but just in general that we get are normally, I want to say when somebody knows the answer might be, maybe we shouldn't do that. The last one we got, I know was, could we use the cleaning closet? And they absolutely were not coming from a place of not trying to give this mother a place to pump. They were just trying to find a space in their office, and the only space that they could find was that. But after we talked through it, we were able to identify another location. I know in some of the offices that I have been at, where the employees were primarily there on site, we've had to go in, and at one time we just had like a large secondary storage closet. And again, I know if you think of storage closets, like I think of storage closets, that may not seem ideal, but this one was actually fairly well organized, and we even went in and organized more of a space. We had like a card table set up and a chair area. We made sure that it was near a plug. It was equipment that we were able to leave out in case other people were walking in and out. It wasn't disrupting the flow of traffic not why the mother was in there, but during the rest of the time of the day so that she didn't have to go in and set up every time she went in there. It had a door that locked. There was no outside windows to it. It didn't have any of the chemicals or things like that. You're thinking of other supply closets. So for us, that was a really reasonable option. Two other times that came into play, things that we were able to make work. One time I was in an office and it was a nice office building and we just happened on the first floor. And as I'm sure many of you are sitting today or have worked in before, had a beautiful glass window that looked right out into the parking lot and it provided a lot of natural light. It was great most of the time, but there were no blinds, there were no curtains on this. And of course, this one situation, it was a horse statue outside the window of the mother that needed the private space to breastfeed. And so then every time a child came up, of course, they were like right in front of her window. So again, could the answer have been that she could have picked up and gone somewhere else? Sure, we could have made that work. But in this particular situation, she was going to try to continue working. She was a salaried exempt employee. She was going to try to continue to answer her phone and go about her business to the degree that she could. So it was as simple as having some very temporary curtains and a line put up. We didn't even use a full rod. We just had a temporary line so that she could open and close her drapes as needed. Similarly, another office, they didn't have any windows, but what we actually had in our office doors themselves, there was that, I guess it is a window, but a clear panel so that you could see whether somebody was in their office or not. And we were able to actually go and find, the word that's popping into my mind is cling wrap, and that's not right, but it wasn't an adhesive, it went on the window with static, and we just got it at Home Depot, but it had like a faux stained glass or that old frosted glass that you used to see or sometimes still see in bathrooms. So you were able to just cut it to the exact size that you wanted, and we were able to put it into the cutout within the door so that, and we chose one of the ones that were more opaque so that you couldn't see through it at all, and it allowed us to temporarily have that shut off. It was like an $8 solution, and actually I think we went on and used it in other spaces in the office because it actually did look nice enough. And then it also gave her some privacy as well. Again, she had a door that locked, but there's a lot of really low cost, reasonable things you can do to meet this standard. Some other ideas that have come up that we have utilized that you might want to think through as well when we're talking about they need a private space. If you have any sort of cameras in your workplace, which a lot of times today we do, you want to make sure that the space that you are choosing is either shielded from that or they are able to set the employee up in an area of that space where they are not on camera. Again, just giving them protections and depending on how you utilize your cameras at work, just to make sure nobody's watching there. So just thinking through those sorts of things as you're going. Again, this space is not supposed to be the bathroom. That's specifically stated in the legislation as not being considered enough of a private place. Even if it's one that's like a single bathroom stall, that still is not meeting the standard. You need to find another space free from view, free from intrusion, or for coworkers coming in and out. So as you're kind of thinking about your own office spaces as we are wrapping up on this here, think through all of those little technicalities, and hopefully there is a space that you could temporarily make work. What I have found is helpful too, though, is, a lot of times you're making these decisions after the employee has come back from leave. They have had the child, so whether they were out for a couple of weeks or whether they were out on FMLA and took 12 full weeks, there's some adjustment time in them coming back to the office where if you had to rework a small space before they got back, you would be able to do that. Or if you needed to make any minor changes, moving employees around. Again, the intent is not to put everyone out and to create a huge disruption in the workplace, but a temporary accommodation, a temporary reasonable change to your office setup or to your employee setup so that they can have that private space. And then just in general, it feels like, I think a lot of the times when we are introducing this information to you guys, that because we get really into the specifics, that it might make it sound more challenging than it is. But this can be minor. And you also have to keep in mind, although the legislation is written in so that it's up to the child's whole first year of birth, the statistics that were pulled when I researched this last week, so near the latest legislation, so take this with a grain of salt, but they said 3 out of 4 mothers right after birth end up breastfeeding or pumping, but by the 6-month mark that drops to down about 15%. So these might be very short accommodations that you have to keep in mind. Again, the new updates, there are some difference in the public sector. If you are in one of those specialty industries where you have some other exemptions from FLSA, which you will know, that means you're working in airlines with Department of Transportation, railroads. They're going to be normal things that you are used to having more regulations implied on you. That is going to be different and exempt from this to some degree. Also, employers who have less than 50 employees, they do still have to meet the standards, but if you can show that this would impose a large business hardship, you could find a way to work around it. I say that, and I mention that with caution, because again, they don't define undue hardship for us. And it can't be just as simple as we don't have a space for them, or, oh, we'd have to spend 2 hours reorganizing to find a space. That's unlikely to be considered undue hardship. Again, that might be one that we get some more clarification on as the year goes on, so that we know possibly how that's being tested or interpreted. So this could apply across industries. Some of the examples that we pulled, Julia is a house cleaner, and she only works for the company on weekends. Well, she's still entitled for that first year to have a private space to be able to pump. One of the new things that would apply, Sam is a registered nurse who is exempt. So the protection now applying to exempt employees is the piece that's new. They still have to be entitled to both the break time and the space afterwards. And it can still tie into that exempt employee's normal time off, but you have to give them more because you can't deny the need for a break to pump. So let's say there are 2 regularly scheduled breaks during the day. Those could be normal. If they were working during the breaks, they'd be paid. If they weren't working and non-exempt, they wouldn't be paid. But if they need 4 breaks over the course of the day, you've got to give them the 4 breaks as well. So I know that was a lot of information. And again, we try to give you all the details for understanding, not so that it's overwhelming. So if you have questions about that or about this space, at any time you can reach out to us, and we're happy to talk through the new legislation or any of the formal rules if you weren't quite as familiar with those. But I'm going to pause for a moment and hand it over to Mitch, and then I'm going to see you guys here at the end.
Thanks, Amanda. So, in the spirit of balance, we cover a topic that has some relevance to the holiday, yet can easily cause complications in the workplace: romance. I'm sure I'm not the only one that enjoys watching Grey's Anatomy, but it's nowhere near as enjoyable when it's your company instead of Grey Sloan with all the workplace dating issues. So while love may be in the air today, it's important to be prepared for when Cupid strikes the workplace. If you break it down, employees spend close to 25% or more of a given week together. Relationships tend to form. Sometimes they're friendships, sometimes they're more romantic. SHRM actually did a study not too long ago where they found that almost 27% of employees are either engaged in or have been in a relationship with a coworker. Sure, we've all witnessed or heard the horror stories of things that can go wrong. Things like favoritism, harassment and discrimination, infidelity, or in extreme cases, possible workplace violence. A couple years back, I was investigating an incident where a relationship went south and the jilted partner actually began stalking the employee. Even after we'd removed the jilted lover from the location, and later we separated his employment, it still took law enforcement intervention to resolve the incident. Even when things are going relatively smooth, there's the potential for outside interactions to bleed over into the workplace. So if the couple gets into an argument outside of work, sometimes those tensions can bleed over into work. Or if there's a situation where there's a power difference between the two, there's likely going to be a perceived conflict of interest, even if both partners are doing everything right. So while I could ramble on for hours with all the horror stories I've investigated, it doesn't mean there aren't successful relationships that can work in the workplace. It just means that there's potential risks and complications that would need to be navigated. So a lot of people tend to lean towards just outright banning romantic relationships, but this isn't necessarily the most effective strategy in all circumstances. Blanket ban would mean things like you can't hire spouses, which would be limiting your employment pool. And it encourages employees that do enter into relationships to lie, keep their relationships a secret, or engage in other deceptive practices to hide the relationship. In the event that the relationship goes south, the company will then be blindsided, leaving management scrambling to try and determine the best course of action after the fact. So I had an investigation a while back where the accuser stated they were constantly being harassed by one of their trainers that was making sexual advances towards them. Throughout the investigation, more and more information was coming to light that there was an underlying relationship between the two that had been going on for months before we received the initial complaint. When the trainer called off the relationship, the accuser then came forward with the allegations in an attempt to try and get back at their ex for breaking up with them. So in the event that a harassment allegation does come in, having that relationship disclosed to management ahead of time can help provide a useful starting point for establishing a timeline to determine what took place and when. In that investigation, the accuser's initial text messages were all from relatively early in the relationship. And when I started requesting text messages from the trainer to try and corroborate different pieces of the story, I was actually able to see that this was when the relationship was called off, his text messages that were sent to her afterwards, trying to reinitiate the relationship, her denying it, things like that, which was where I was really able to pinpoint when that transitioned from a relationship between two consenting adults into more of a harassment case. So a more common approach that companies are starting to shift towards is to require employees to disclose their relationships and prohibit relationships between direct reports or relationships that create a disruptive environment. Some companies will go a step further by restricting management from engaging in relationships with any subordinates. By requiring employees to report a relationship and prohibiting direct reports, this gives the company the chance to potentially look to transfer employees to a different manager or department and mitigate potential conflicts of interest or nepotism before it happens. I had another one where an employee was applying for a promotion and they were in a relationship with one of the managers who ended up on the interview panel. While the partner that was interviewing for the promotion had the necessary qualifications, they'd shown themselves to be an excellent employee, and ultimately was one of the best candidates for the promotion, the entire interview loop was called into question once that relationship was revealed. This could have easily been navigated ahead of time had the manager reported the relationship from the start, giving us the chance to either excuse the manager from the panel or find an alternate assignment to try and avoid the conflict of interest while still putting both participants in the relationship into positions where they could succeed. So by restricting relationships between supervisors and subordinates or limiting managers to not dating in the workplace, it can also help mitigate potential harassment stemming from a power balance. I'm sure we've all seen the news where all the stories are coming out of Hollywood where individuals may not feel comfortable saying no to somebody who has the power to impact their employment and well-being. So if you have a policy in place that can help address those situations, it'll hopefully protect your employees and the company as well. So another one, having a policy that addresses public displays of affection can help maintain a positive work environment for other coworkers as well. While you can't police your employees' free time outside of work, you can establish policies that help ensure their coworkers won't have to be worried about walking in on relationships or walking in on two employees making out in the break room. Even things like flirting or strictly emotional relationships, so relationships without a physical component can become a distraction. If one or both parties are in a relationship, it'll become a source of gossip. If you see two coworkers that are constantly flirting back and forth, not only are they not focused on their own work, it can be a distraction for others as well. So one practice that's becoming more and more common are love contracts. So this is a disclosure between the two employees in the relationship and the company that governs the expectations while at work. This can cover things like workplace behavior expectations, requirements to recuse themselves from potential conflicts of interest, or other potential workplace decisions that could impact their partner. It'll have an acknowledgement that the relationship is consensual, an acknowledgement that any breakups will not result in retaliatory behavior, and the expectation that coworkers remain professional if the relationship ends. So those agreements, they'll help mitigate potential harassment claims. They don't eliminate them entirely, but they can help reinforce the expectations of the employees while they're in that relationship. So some companies have even taken things a step further. While I was preparing for this, I was reading up on different companies' policies and their positions on it. A really interesting one was Meta, so the company that owns and operates Facebook. They've taken a lot more of a permissive approach. So under their policy, you can ask out coworkers you know, but you have to have met them in person. With them being a tech company, they have all kinds of back-end systems. So if you're scrolling through there and you see somebody's picture attached to an instant message, you can't ask them out just because you think they're attractive. It does have to be somebody that you've met in person. The other thing that they included in their policy was a one and done process where you can ask somebody out, but if they say no to a date, you cannot ask them out again. They don't even need to explicitly say no. It's as simple as, hey, I'm busy. They say they're busy, you can't ask them out again. So it's a way to take a more permissive approach and help regulate how those interactions happen, but still maintain a level of control over what takes place in the workplace. So keep in mind, even with the best policies and procedures in place, some employees will still try to hide their relationships. So in situations where there's infidelity between one or both partners, the employees will be more likely to keep their affair secret from the company. They don't want their spouses to find out, so they don't want anybody at the company to know about. It's also been found that individuals in the LGBTQ community may not be as likely to disclose their relationship, especially if one or both participants are still closeted and not open about their sexual preferences. Some employees may just decide that they want to deny a relationship. And if you have a policy that just blanket prohibits it, it's more likely. But in a situation like that, you can still look at their behavior and conduct and try to base potential actions off that. So I had one a couple of years ago where 2 employees were denying being in a relationship. Despite my investigation, finding quite a bit of evidence to suggest a relationship, I couldn't definitively prove it. And there wasn't any sort of conflict of interest in their roles. However, we outlined their expectations for their behavior at work to both of them and continue to monitor. Once their behavior became a disruption in the workplace, we were then able to take the appropriate actions in line with our policies. In that case, it escalated to a level where we actually had to reassign both of them to different accounts so that we could address the workplace conduct. So I know I've covered kind of some of the pitfalls and stuff, but what goes into a strong policy? Well, if you're not going to just blanket ban relationships, focus more on the expectations of those workplace relationships. Have well-defined policies that cover things like fraternization, dating and relationships, as well as nepotism. Those policies should address the appropriate and inappropriate behavior by all employees, such as unwanted physical contact or gossip. The policy should also clearly define what relationships are permitted, if any, and what relationships are prohibited. So if you're going to allow 2 coworkers to date, but you're not going to allow somebody in management to date a regular employee, that should be defined within that policy. If applicable, they should also include the expectations regarding reporting. So who they'd report it to, what the process would be, what potential actions could be taken as far as when they report that, as well as the consequences for not reporting a relationship. One thing to keep in mind is that some states actually have different privacy laws that would address that. For example, in Colorado, you can't fire an employee for conduct outside of work. So in that case, even if they're in a relationship outside of work, you can't terminate for that, but you could potentially take other actions depending on your policies. If you include a love contract in there, it's a good idea to, at least at a high level, cover the expectations of that. Keep in mind, again, that while you cannot police behavior outside of work, you can still have your policies cover expectations at company events or functions. One interesting piece that I came across while I was working on this may not apply to everybody on this call, but California actually has prohibited companies from requiring employees asking about relationships. So it's always a good idea that when you're drafting your policies, just take a look at the states you operate in to make sure that you're compliant with those state laws. So simply put, while you could pretend that relationships don't happen at work, they do. Happens far more frequently than most people realize. So it's always far more effective to have those policies in place to maintain a healthy work environment and address relationships before they become an issue. I know I kind of covered everything at a high level, and each situation can be a little bit unique. So if you have any questions or you need help navigating a workplace relationship, don't hesitate to give us a call and we'd be happy to talk through it more in depth. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Amanda, who will be diving into some interesting Supreme Court rulings.
Thanks, Mitch. You know, part of me while you were talking wished we were in a seminar and we could have Mentimetered and asked who'd been in a workplace romance before and whether it ended well or not, but maybe next time. A few cases we wanted to touch base with you guys on. We're not going to deep dive like we did last month into one specific case, but a lot of times you might catch snippets on the news or maybe in a feed or an email if you subscribe to any legal or HR updates or even just business and management updates. You'll hear little bits of rulings from the Supreme Court or maybe coming soon to the Supreme Court. And the reason I really wanted to touch on this today and really kind of keep in the back of our minds, we might touch on them in later months, is one of the things that I mentioned before and Mitch referenced non-directly in his as well, is what's so challenging with a lot of the employment laws and the HR interpretations of those laws is it's not always very clear. We get this very ambiguous language of reasonable or unmet. You know, there are words that, although you might understand them logically, what that actually means in the situation and in the workplace, the government doesn't give us an actual definition for, or if they do, it's still very vague. And we have to look at case law, we have to look at rulings to see how it was actually interpreted by different courts. And that's a lot of times how we help guide you guys through the decision-making process. Because more often than not, when the phone rings or we get the initial email, you know, the question is phrased, can I do this? Can I fire this person? That's the one we get the most. Can I do this? And Mitch and I, or anyone else you get here at Ironwood, will normally tell you, well, sure, you can. I feel like I'm referencing my mom correcting my English. You can do that. Should you do that though? Maybe not. Let's talk through everything you need to consider when you are deciding whether or not the example I use, termination as the outcome. And a lot of times we are pulling from these cases in the background. So one of the key ones I wanted to start with, I've got three and we'll see on time how much we're able to get to. I'll at least do high level for sure. But the first one was actually a court case that just did go to the Supreme Court, and it had both disability and discrimination and FMLA retaliation. So I liked that it covered two things because we do actually see this quite a bit. A lot of times somebody will call in about, oh, this person is going out because they have this disease and they are going to be out the 12 weeks and they're going to come back, but they might have limited abilities when they come back. So we see this interplay pretty often. So I also like this case because sometimes I feel like we accidentally focus on situations where the ruling went with the employee so that we can tell you, oh gosh, here's all the things that went wrong. This did go for the employer. So I like pointing out all the things that they did right. And I also want to highlight a lot of times, if you are talking to your employees, you are trying to make it work. You are doing a lot of these steps. You know, we throw around the phrases like interactive process or, you know, qualifying periods if we're talking about FMLA. A lot of times you are doing this without necessarily realizing it, or you're doing it 75%, we just need to maybe do one or two more things. And then of course we need to document it. That's normally where most of the time we run into trouble. But this was actually a case out of Drake University. So one of the employees had been there for 28 years and then got a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. So if you're unaware, I cannot say that. MS is not curable. You can maintain the quality of life to some degree ongoing, but it's going to be ongoing treatment and care, and it could present in 100 different ways. So it's entirely possible that they might have had it for some time, but it didn't affect their work. But employee for 28 years, a new dean is appointed, and this specific manager actually reported directly to the dean. So prior to the dean knowing anything about this employee, they're brand new. They don't have the 27 years of history prior to the one that they're in now. Started having, the dean was a male and the employee was a female. He started having trouble with erratic attendance. She was coming in late, she was leaving early, she was out sick to the degree that it was affecting business. But he had no idea she had MS. So when he sat down and talked with her about it, and then they brought in HR, this was a business that had HR, to talk about FMLA, she disclosed the MS then. So again, HR is there with the manager. They are giving her the FMLA certification forms. So if you have not used those before, there's a series of federal forms that you give to the employer, that you have the employee take to the doctor, and then you have to complete the paperwork on the employer end. And there's some pretty specific timelines you have to meet there, but they're all federal forms. So HR gives the employee, here's what you need to take to your doctor, here's what we need to know, takes it to the doctor. So everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing at this point. Takes it to the doctor completes it. On this paperwork, if you haven't seen it or had to do any disability related paperwork, it asks questions of the medical professional as far as how often should we expect this person to be out? How often should they have episodes? If they are out, how long should they be out? Or are they going to have more frequent doctor's appointments, things like that, so that you as the employer can try to accommodate or work with them to the degree possible. So the doctor fills out this information, everybody has it. But the employee's performance issues continue. So in this case, it was intermittent FMLA. So not 12 weeks straight, but might need to be a day here or there or half a day to go to the doctor. Issues continue, still calling out, still failing to meet absenteeism and tardiness standards beyond just the medical requirements, not just what the doctor said might happen, because sometimes they are to some degree just providing an estimate that could change over time, but taking time off unrelated to any of the medical issues and failing to meet their standards. So again, they come back in and they talk to the employee with the manager and the HR rep, and they're discussing the issues, and they issue that performance improvement plan. So a lot of times it's just an outline of the steps of what has to be done for them to get to write the course. Here's what our expectations are of you. And then they ended it with, this is a final warning, failure for achievement could result in disciplinary action. I do want to point out at this phase that, again, a lot of times we are talking through this process with you or through the ADA process. And because we're telling you about these steps involved, I'll then get calls a month later and be like, oh, but I can't do anything because they're on FMLA. That's not entirely true. You are still setting a contract with that employee about what the process is. You can still say, if you are going to be out, we need this much notice. If there is going to be a change for your health, you can request a recertification every 30 days. You are not being held hostage. You just need to be a little bit more on alert. And again, follow procedures, make sure you're documenting. So this continues to go on there, and she's on final warning. 2 months later, no improvement continues to happen, unrelated to the FMLA or the absences. And it comes time for termination. She's terminated. They cite the exact reasons, nothing to do with the MS or the FMLA, just the actual attendance. Employee files the suit. I was discriminated against because of my MS, because I asked for FMLA. And in this situation, it was good for the employer because the court came back and said specifically that because they established a robust, well-documented steps of legitimate reasons, that the termination was valid. So this is one more example where making sure that you have the documentation to back up the steps that you are taking, save them not only from an FMLA suit, but also tacking onto that ADA discrimination and retaliation, which could have then brought in several different laws and several different penalties. And again, I do really want to focus on a lot of times your guys' instincts are on. You are asking us questions, and sure, we might give more information, and it's okay if you didn't have any to start with, but a lot of times you're on the right track. Somebody's been out sick a lot. You've not pushed it too far, but you've said, hey, is everything going okay? That can be a way to start that interactive process. It's just making sure that you document that if they disclose the illness, they're qualified for FMLA, that you get them that paperwork. Again, there's some pretty tight timelines that you're required to follow as an employer, not only for your records, but because if they are going to get 12 weeks, you want that 12-week clock to start as soon as possible. That way that you can start focusing on the next steps, especially if it's going to be intermittent, because that could carry out over the course of the year. So just getting your mindset around, those buzzwords. If you have not dealt with FMLA and it's come up before, that's a good time to reach out and we're happy to help, or ADA, or even if you're just not quite sure exactly what you need to document, that's one of the things, that's an easy thing for us to talk you through. And a lot of times we're able to shoot you some sample forms if you don't have anything that exists. So that's a case where the employer did everything right and Supreme Court ruled with them. The next one I want to mention is actually in between the Circuit Court of Appeals and is expected to go to the Supreme Court, or it is going to the Supreme Court. We're expected to hear something April-ish. And this one I didn't realize at first. It's Third Circuit's Groff versus DeJoy, which I would not have recognized off the top of my head, but I had heard about this once I started reading the details because it involves the U.S. Postal Service and that they now require some employees to work on Sundays. On the off chance that you have not seen or heard about that, a lot of times for a variety of reasons, continuity of service, to help fund the USPS, there are Postal Service employees that are now delivering on Sundays, sometimes subcontracted out for other organizations. Sometimes that's how you might get an Amazon delivery on Sunday. So some employees are now being required to work on Sundays, whereas for however many years before that, 150 years before that, that has never been the case. So an employee in this case filed a religious discrimination suit saying that they needed to have the day off. And again, as we're talking through this language, if it was an employee asking for religious accommodation, we actually hear about that all of the time. And the most common example you might hear is, somebody, and I'm just picking the one that's most mainstream, but somebody celebrates Hanukkah instead of Christmas. And so to be able to give that person Hanukkah off, maybe with paid time, that employee agrees to work over Christmas, while those other employees that are off for Christmas are covering while that person's on Hanukkah. It's a quick accommodation that, again, probably happens, and people make agreements. You don't even realize that you've just worked through in a religious accommodation. You've just tried to work with your employees and covered it. But so on the grounds of religious accommodation, of needing Sunday off, that it's supposed to be a day of rest, in this case, so far, the employee has not been excused from work, and the Third Circuit Court of Appeals did actually uphold this. And the case here being is that it was placed too big of a burden upon the employer. Not only that specific U.S. Postal Service, but it was too much of a burden upon all of the other employees in this person's department in their sector. And I think something that could have gone into consideration there too, because again, there's normally 10 different factors at play, is the number of people that could have possibly applied to. So at this stage, we're expecting it to be ruled upon in April is what they're giving as the estimation for now. But again, this is one that you might hear on the news because it involves the U.S. Postal Service, and I feel like that skyrockets things into the news. But if you do run into a situation, again, where you aren't sure how to work with somebody who might have different religious beliefs than the main holidays that you might grant people off, again, happy to answer any questions on that. There's lots of things. If that swapping wouldn't work for you, it doesn't mean that you can't have clauses in your PTO time off, doesn't mean you can't offer unpaid time off. There are lots of different options, but this case is also showing that sometimes you can't always accommodate it. again, you have to be able to prove undue hardship, which is not defined, but we're happy to talk through that with you as well. And then the last one we're going to touch on today is gender-based wage discrimination. And I like this example because it's actually, at least for me, the one that I hear about the most when people talk about wage discrimination between genders. So this applies to the Equal Pay Act. So this is out of the Eighth Circuit. And again, the courts thus far has held up the employer's choices. So again, this is a company that has been doing everything right, and they checked all their boxes, and they probably really made an effort to document why these things were done. But a female worker alleged that she was being paid less than two of her male colleagues, which they could see, obviously, but that they were equally qualified, so that they were hired at the same time, they performed the same work. And we see this come up a lot, especially if you have very general job titles, or even a lot of times people will call and say, do I even need a job description for everyone? Can't everyone just basically be under the same one? This is one of those situations where titles do matter, where job descriptions do matter, because who they pulled to look for that wage equivalent, to look for that experience and those qualifications there is going to be dependent upon things like titles through departments, through job categories. So I'm not saying to any extent that you need to get super hung up on that, but you do need to think it through and the other ways that it could apply. So in this case, she is saying she was equal on all fronts. They're just as equal as far as qualifications and experience. But the employer went through, they did a really thorough analysis. So they plotted all of the jobs in the categories. They really broke down and did a good compensation review for checking for equality to make sure that if there were different rates of pay, that they were justified. So that, somebody with, I'm using examples, somebody here that has 0 to 3 years of experience makes this amount. Somebody that has 3 to 6 makes this amount. And there could be what we call bands. There could be some leeway between two amounts, but again, that it's fairly well defined based on factors, or that somebody with this degree is eligible for maybe a step higher, even though they don't have that level of experience. It can be a complicated system of exceptions that still define the whole compensation program, but you do need to have a reason. If there were two people with the exact same start date, exact same qualifications, if it was a man and woman making something entirely different, you could run into a problem. But the employer was able to prove that this, after their compensation analysis, that the pay differential was based on things completely outside of being a man versus a woman. That when in fact, when they were looking at the two individuals that she cited that she was equal to as far as experience, that one had used the machinery at another company before, so he had more years of experience. And then the other one had a role for a decade that some aspects of the service, so maybe it wasn't exactly the same title, but like a third of the job responsibilities carried over into this role. So maybe they didn't credit him for 10 years of experience, but generally they credited him for 3 or 4. So at the end of the day, it ended up that both of the men in question did really have more experience, whether specifically in that field or in a related field, so that when they laid out how long someone has been there, that it's not just necessarily how long they've been with that company or in that exact role. It's a full scope of their background experience. So this one, again, they've ruled with the employer at this point to say that it was justified, but it's a good reminder, if you do have some pretty varied pay practices, or if it comes up, what else we see a lot is because the market has pushed things so towards employees right now, sometimes we're paying entry-level employees at a rate that's much higher than our tenured employees. That it needs to be balanced out and examined every few years, because you could inadvertently put yourself in a situation similar to this, where you have created these pay discrepancies, sometimes without even realizing, because you were just trying to meet the market. So again, that one, it ended up not being a gender wage discrimination, but I liked that example too, because it had both the compensation piece and the gender piece. Okay, and with that, it looks like Elizabeth sent us a note and said that she actually lost power, but it doesn't look like we've got anything in the chat. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up for the day, but I know we covered a lot, especially in trying to touch on these last three cases at a high level. If you have questions about that, about employment relationships or policies, or any of the other things we discussed, if you haven't talked to us before, reach out to Elizabeth and she can get you the partnership agreement and get you our contact information, and we'll help try to guide you through that process. Otherwise, we will see you guys hopefully on the 7th for the first quarter seminar on performance management, and then again next month for Clear Up the Chaos. Thanks, guys. We appreciate you being here.